If you look at what is happening in the Ukraine now, we are seeing a meat grinder. The Russians have absolutely no compassion about their own people or the Koreans that are fighting on their side, and they are literally grinding out tens of thousands a month, and that would mean in a similar position we would go through our army or our standing army in about 6 months.
Now, the head of Britain's armed forces has warned that the world stands at the dawn of a third nuclear age in which Britain is threatened by multiple threats. But in a speech at the defence think tank RUSI, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin said there would be only a remote chance Russia would directly attack or invade the UK if the two countries were at war.
We are at the dawn of a third nuclear age, which is altogether more complex. From Russia, we have seen wild threats of tactical nuclear use, large-scale nuclear exercises, and simulated attacks against NATO countries, all designed to coerce us from taking the action required to maintain stability.
Well, that warning came after the Defence Minister Alistair Cairns said the army would be wiped out in as little as 6 months if forced to fight a war on the scale of the Ukraine conflict. Well, let's talk to Calvin Bailey, Labour MP for Leighton and Wanstead, and a former RAF squadron commander. Good evening to you, Calvin.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, really good to have you with us. Some pretty dire warnings, though, here. Let me ask you, first of all, about that warning from Alistair Cairns, who himself is a former military commander. He is saying that the army would be wiped out in as little as 6 months if we were facing a war of the type that Ukraine is now confronting.
Yeah, I think so. What Al was talking about today was the type of conflict. What he was doing was placing into context the size of our standing professional army, which sits at about 70-odd thousand troops at the moment, and then applying the atrophy rates that we're seeing in Ukraine. And using that simple equation, he's saying that's about 6 months worth of fighting. And if you look at what is happening in the Ukraine now, we are seeing a meat grinder. The Russians have absolutely no compassion about their own people or the Koreans that are fighting on their side, and they are literally grinding out tens of thousands a month. And that would mean in a similar position, we would go through our army or our standing army in about 6 months.
Well, I mean, the head of the armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, is saying there's only a remote chance of Russia actually directly attacking the UK, although, of course, we have seen some of those hybrid attacks, cyber attacks, poisonings and so on. But when you look at what has happened in Ukraine, it does really suggest, doesn't it, that we need to massively ramp up our defence spending and perhaps those conventional armed forces.
Absolutely. And I think now we are getting, a few years ago, I was just chatting to some people who said, Calvin, you were having these discussions a couple of years ago. The path to where we are now has been a very slow, measured, deliberate path by Russia to undermine the systems and the states that have held the liberal order that we've enjoyed for so long. And so from entering Georgia to taking the Crimea and then ultimately working into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this is all part of a gradual escalation. And unless we confront that escalation with credible deterrence, it isn't going to stop there. And it's really important that we understand that our national security, like Ukraine, isn't a choice for us. It is making sure that Russia is adequately deterred is fundamental to the values that we have enjoyed and taken for granted for so long. And that will require us to have larger fighting forces. And the discussion today wasn't about a mass mobilization. It was about how you would bring to bear larger numbers of people, and we would do that through the reservists.
But don't we need to, at the very start, ramp up our spending to the 2.5%, which the government has said it will get to? But once again, when the Prime Minister was asked about this today, no date. I mean, there's no point in having these milestones if you don't have a date as to when you're ever going to get there.
Well, you need to have targets to work to. You need to have things that drive and move on the discussion. And if we look back only a few years ago, best part of our NATO partners weren't even meeting 2%. We were, and now we're pretty much all there. There's a few outliers, and we've kind of got to have this discussion about how we move things on. But it's pointless throwing out the milestone is there to get to have the discussion and the debate, and to get people like me on the radio explaining why it is we're asking for more money. But what's fundamental to that is you've got to have the design to show what you're going to spend that money on, and that is the strategic defence review. And so the target of 2.5 in essence is to say to the reviewers that this is our jumping off point. What does it look like? Like, when do we need to get there? And you would have seen over the last week there was.
Well, it sounds like we need to get there, I mean, pretty quickly, given the scale of these warnings. And we've also got Sir Tony Radakin, Chief of the Armed Forces, saying that we're facing a third nuclear age. So we need to retain our nuclear deterrent as well.
Absolutely. And that's part of the ultimately, that is part of the deterrent logic. That to be able to deter, you have to have a credible deterrence, and escalations have to be counterbalanced adequately. And don't underestimate the fact that the present arsenal that we have right now is a deterrent, and maintaining that deterrent and justifying that deterrent and explaining to people why we have that deterrent is really fundamental in making sure that we sustain it with adequately financially, and that we resource the other parts that go in and about it. And that is going to be a challenge. But you are entirely right. We are going to have to go quickly. Right? Look at the instability that is literally everywhere in the world. There isn't anywhere, any region at the moment that you can't see an interconnected problem, from the instability in Korea across into the Middle East. What you've seen in Syria is a direct result of what was happening in Ukraine, and also to the south in Gaza and the Lebanon. All of these things are interconnected, and we need to understand that our peace is part of that interconnectedness, and therefore we have got to have a credible deterrent and a credible plan for making sure that we are able to respond to any escalations. Because the only way to win a war is to not have a war.
We're going to have to leave it there. Calvin Bailey, Labour MP and former RAF Squadron Commander.